what's done and what should be done. There is a massive difference between the two, and it was very well delineated by the electoral system of the British in the 1800s. The pursuit of bribery, alcohol, and what you may call the deprivation of human rights is what had driven the thirst for power that every candidate who stood in the election dreamt of.
A handful of people in Britain were allowed to vote. Put into perspective, it was 1 in 10 men, the aristocrats being the majority of them. There were so many barriers which had risen at the time that wholly determined who would vote and who wouldn't. Not only this, but the mere certitude that secret ballots were not considered as an option at the time meant people who voted were in a dire situation.
They had to announce who they would vote for. This put them under immense pressure, and if they didn't vote for the one candidate who needed to be elected, the electorates were exploited with the eloquence of alcohol and bribery. If you haven't noticed, I haven't mentioned women yet, and that is primarily because women never got to vote. They were apparently too imbecile to understand the jeopardy of politics. Or were they? MPs bribed constituencies as a whole, and the constituencies would sell themselves to the highest bidder.
There was a lack of representation of new northern towns as well as for the middle and working class. In fact, towns with extremely small amounts of population were represented instead. Yes, pal, you got it right. Brought in boroughs. That's exactly what I'm talking about. And yeah, definitely, people from the working class could compete in the elections to get voted for, but that wouldn't be feasible because MPs were not paid back then. Only the rich had the monetary capacity to become members of parliament. All of this put together meant that out of the 20 million people of Britain, the 450,000 who were eligible to vote decided to run the lives of the rest.
But that is just biased. In fact, the whole system was biased. So, in the name of making it unprejudiced, Mr. Lord Grey, Prime Minister of England from November 1830 to July 1834, initiated an act to amend the representation of people in England and Wales. In short, the Reform Act of 1832 in Britain. Believe it or not, this act has a reputation for alleviating the problems people back in Britain had. It rightfully redistributed seats in the House of Commons, giving representations to large towns and cities, and disenfranchising over 56 rotten boroughs, and reduced another 31 to only 1 MP. It also largely expanded the electorate, the body of people allowed to vote, by granting suffrage
So
to
this
women.
apparently only did a good thing to the people of Britain. My friends from the working class were still not happy. And that's because although the Act of 1832 expanded suffrage, it didn't create a democracy. It lowered property requirements, but there was still no suffrage for the working class. So my angry young men decided to initiate a Chartist movement. Because why not? To give you a little heads up, the Chartists were working class agitators. Their temper had no bounds, so much so that the government was compelled to call in a cavalry, which killed 15, leaving hundreds injured.
The Chartists came up with the People's Charter, that, in their opinion, was to make the government much more accountable overall, and it demanded 6 things. Number 1, universal male suffrage, which means that every man over 21 should be given the right to vote.
Equal-sized electoral district.
Number 3, voting by secret ballot.
no property qualification.
Number 5. Pay for MPs.
Annual election of parliament.
Politicians of both parties, namely the Whigs and Tories, saw Chartists as enemies of property and public order. Eventually, the Chartist movement ended without achieving its aims, and the fear of civil unrest remained.
However, later in the century, Chartist ideas were adopted in the Reform Acts of 1884 and 1867, and that's how Britain acquired its new reformed democratic system of current times, becoming the first politically organized proletarian revolutionary movement of the masses.